past year, the African continent has seen a surge in people-led resistance movements. Most recently, anti-government protests in Kenya, which saw President William Ruto retract a controversial finance bill and fire nearly his entire cabinet. Then we saw in Nigeria a series of protests which erupted over the years with calls for an end to bad governance and armed forces inside communities. Other countries include Uganda and Tunisia, where protests against corruption, economic decline and insecurity have emerged. Let's get some perspective on all of these and to see whether there are convergent issues and whether the continent is seeing a protest-led revolution and what the impact of some of these protests will have on permanent change. Kwame Senou is the founder of the Holding Opinion and Public. Good evening, good morning to you and welcome to the program. This is so interesting, the latest piece that you wrote, looking at all of these different conflicts. I know one of the comments you make is that some of the explanations as to why they're happening right now, why they have the specific profiles that they do in the countries in which they are happening, and what they are about haven't been adequately explained. So I would love to get just a perspective from you as an opener on the historical context based on what we've seen in the 90s, in 1950s, the 1960s, and what we're seeing now in the 2000s.
In the 50s and 60s, what was happening was basically the exposure to local governance after colonization. So big promises were made then, and when the promises failed, there was protest and there were many coups. What is happening now is that since the 90s, we have been experiencing democracy, at least elections on the continent. And 30 years down the road, it's now time to kind of look back. And what we see, and if you look at the numbers from the Edelman Trust Barometer, you mentioned Nigeria, Kenya, and I would add South Africa for a perspective, governments are not trusted. 42% only in Kenya and Nigeria, 29% in South Africa. And trust is about competence and ethics. Let's face it, our government competent today? Are they delivering on what they promised themselves? That's really a question. When you see the level of unemployment, the issue of the economy, the cost of living crisis, and all that. And on the ethical aspect, constantly corruption makes the headline in the media without any adequate response to that. I was reading someone on Twitter the other day asking what was really the final outcome of the Zondo Commission in South Africa, for instance. So this is what is happening now. Governments are not trusted because they are not seen as competent and ethical.
And you also write that, we don't even have to go as far back as the 50s and 60s to look at the changes in the profile of protests and the reason people are pouring out onto the streets. Even if we look at unrest and political instability in 2010, 2018 and 2020, there seems to be a changing face around this. And I think what's so interesting is the observation that you make that it's less issue-driven, or not less issue-driven. The issues are inside a bigger issue around wanting systemic overhaul. Talk to us about that.
What we see is that democracy is about people government. So the government is accountable to the people. But that's not what has been practiced over time. Government seems to think that they are free of any oversight, and the political elite on the continent seems to operate in a tone-deaf manner to the rest of the population. So what is requested now by the protesters, and we're coming back to that, is a complete overhaul, a complete integration of the will of the people into how government plan the future of our nations, which we have not seen so far. There seems to be a disconnect between what government wants to achieve. And let me give you an example. When governments are communicating, they are very much focused on GDP growth. But if you ask the average Ivorian, South African, Kenyan, Ugandan, what matters for them, they want to know that their kids can go to school up to university. They want to know that they can put food on the table every day. They want to know they can be treated when they are sick, even if it is chronic disease like cancers. And that's really where the overhaul is requested. How do we come to a situation where government are accountable to the people, where people will for their country are taken into account?
There's also another interesting profile to all of this, Kwame, and we actually spoke about it in the aftermath of the tax protests in places like Kenya. This is the hashtag Reject the Finance Bill protests. Young people, Gen Zers particularly, leading up the charge. And what you saw was an organic gathering of people, galvanized and, in a sense, then organizing after the fact. But really saying this far and no more, expressing some of the themes you already touched on around the breaking of trust, feeling that the social contract with them has also been broken. Why is this also an important indicator? And even though, we're talking about Kenya specifically, what does it mean for the rest of the African continent where, as you know, we have quite a significant youth population?
Yes, that is something everyone should be aware of. The youth is the majority. And in democracy, majority is supposed to be the winner, which is not the case for the moment. Across the continent, 3/4 of the Africans are below the age of 35, which is known as the line of youth. And when you look at the numbers in Kenya, and we talk about Gen Z, I usually advise my partners that the Gen Z is now coming into a phase of age where it is confronted to the reality. The youngest Gen Z was born in 97. He or she is now facing the reality of life, paying a rent, having to find a job. And when there were massive coverage about the Kenyan protests, there was one young guy that was interviewed, and what he said is really interesting. He said, "My girlfriend see me as a failure. I am out to protest because I am seen as a failure." And that's exactly how they are feeling now. They are feeling lost, desperate. They don't see any future coming, and government are not communicating and taking action enough to reassure them. Because also they are connected, there is possibility for them to quickly gather and create social movement. And they have less tolerance for the behavior of our government compared to their elders. Yeah.
I want to cover a big issue before I let you go, and we're almost out of time, and I just would encourage people to go and read your piece, because what you also talk about in the context of millennials and Gen Zers was, kind of coming into the world in a context where there could be optimism, the potential for a political and economic turnaround in their various contexts, and then the dawning realization that actually, this was going to have to be a dream deferred and things weren't going to go in the direction in which they had hoped. So I thought that was an important comment that you had made in the piece that you wrote. We have been talking, Kwame, about the possibility of an Arab Spring, effect on the African continent in terms of other African countries. We've been talking about it for the last 14 years. I'm not sure that we've seen it in quite the same way that we saw the Arab Spring take hold from that incident in Tunisia and then, kind of create this contagion effect across the Middle East. Why do you believe that do you believe that we might be on the cusp of an African Spring, warned by these events that we've already been seeing? Just keep it brief for me, please, Kwame, as you wrap.
Yes, I'm not sure we can quickly draw a parallel between the two situations. But what we can see is that the country where there were coup d'etat were country where the military was trusted more than the government, the elected official. That tells you that wherever you see this framework, the military might be seen as a solution to the government. And there is also, and if you look at the latest Afrobarometer report, there is also a growing tendency for the youth to call in the military to rein on elected leaders when they fail to deliver.
Yeah.
So I can see that happening in other countries where the military might be willing to take action. Hopefully not, because democracy is still preferred by most Africans, including the young people.
Kwame Senou, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Love to have you back, because we need to talk more about what you've raised in your op-ed. Thank you for your time this morning.